Prince William is standing in a room full of highly polished, deeply experienced royal advisors, and he has just pushed a thick, meticulously prepared briefing folder away from him across the heavy mahogany table, as though the very paper it was printed on were fundamentally radioactive, setting the stage for a confrontation that has absolutely nothing to do with standard palace public relations and absolutely everything to do with a terrified father drawing an immovable line in the sand. The harrowing story pulsating quietly through the panicked corridors of the palace is that his youngest son, Prince Louis, is dealing with a highly serious, incredibly frightening health crisis, and the vast, relentless machinery of the royal communications apparatus is desperately trying to figure out exactly how much sensitive medical information to feed to a hungry, expectant public. But the Prince of Wales is simply, unequivocally not having it, delivering a confirmation of his stance that is remarkably brief, fiercely controlled, and ultimately devastating to the established protocols of the firm. The real narrative heartbeat here, the detail that truly matters more than any official bulletin, is what he resolutely refused to say, and that is where this whole agonizing situation twists into something profound and historically unprecedented, because the more you critically examine what was traditionally supposed to happen in a monarchy facing a family crisis versus what actually happened in this enclosed, tension-filled space, the clearer it becomes that this was never about managing a tricky media narrative or appeasing the voracious tabloid beast. This was about a desperate father realizing with bone-chilling clarity that no amount of ancient royal protocol, armed guards, or gilded gates was going to protect his vulnerable child from the visceral reality of fear, prompting a radical shift in how the modern crown operates under pressure. William sat rigidly beside Catherine before reviewing the final wording of what was essentially a highly sanitized, carefully constructed palace statement designed to placate the masses, and he kept halting the review process every single time his eyes caught the specific sentence that dared to mention Louis by name, feeling the immense, crushing weight of a lifetime spent learning to surgically sever his private emotional reality from his unyielding public duty, a ruthless discipline that forms the very core of the job description for the heir apparent, the person destined from birth to bear the immense burden of the crown. But in this suffocating, heartbreaking moment, that lifelong, ironclad discipline was spectacularly failing him, prompting him to stare down the senior aide seated across the table and declare with absolute quiet authority that his son had to come before absolutely every single public engagement on the calendar, a statement that effectively shattered centuries of royal precedent prioritizing the institution over the individual. Catherine, possessing an incredibly sharp, battle-tested understanding of the media beast that constantly circles their lives, understood perfectly why her husband hesitated, deeply knowing that offering the press too little information would inevitably fuel wild, uncontrolled speculation that could spiral into dangerous conspiracy theories. But explaining too much would instantly transform an innocent 11-year-old boy into a permanent subject of global forensic medical examination, and she unhesitatingly chose fierce maternal protection over offering the public any comfortable, temporary reassurance. She looked intently at William and softly but firmly reminded him that once those highly specific medical words left the safety of that closed room and entered the public domain, they could never, ever be taken back, prompting him to meet her gaze and state with absolute finality that Louis must never be made to feel as though the entire country had been casually invited into a vulnerable, terrifying struggle that belonged solely and exclusively to him. Therefore, the heavily debated confirmation ultimately released to the world revealed only the barest outline that a family crisis was indeed occurring, offering zero diagnosis, providing zero treatment details, and outlining zero future prognosis, a masterclass in restrictive communication that left the press scrambling. William forcefully rejected any drafted wording that even vaguely described hospital tests or clinical specifics. making it explicitly clear to his team that he would gladly and humbly explain his own canceled appearances and altered travel plans, taking whatever professional criticism came his way, but he would provide absolutely nothing beyond that strict boundary, establishing the unshakable rule that the royal diary could be endlessly rewritten, but his son's fundamental right to medical privacy could not be bargained away for the sake of institutional convenience. To truly grasp the profound gravity of this stance, the timeline of the crisis becomes critically important because this tense announcement in the briefing room was not the first moment the nightmare became real. There was a far more terrifying, deeply private turning point earlier that fundamentally convinced William and Catherine that this situation was not merely a temporary scare or a passing childhood illness. It happened during what was supposed to be a perfectly mundane, ordinary family evening at Adelaide Cottage, their secluded, carefully protected sanctuary near Windsor, where there was no heavy ceremonial expectation, no cameras, and no public gaze, until Louis suddenly became unwell with such alarming speed and severity that his panicked parents abandoned absolutely everything and sought immediate, urgent medical attention, shattering the quiet peace of their home. That frantic, heart-stopping night became the absolute point of no return, because while there had been quiet, private medical consultations arranged prior to this event, due to Louis showing enough concerning symptoms to make extreme caution necessary, the family had still desperately clung to the fragile hope that his playful, routine childhood could continue largely untouched by the shadow of illness. Adelaide Cottage had purposefully become the fortified emotional bunker where they tirelessly worked to keep the crushing pressure of royal life outside, as William knew all too well from his own traumatic, highly publicized past, how terrifyingly fast a royal childhood could be transformed into public property, and he completely refused to let medical uncertainty become the defining narrative of his youngest son's formative years. Then that ordinary evening violently broke apart, with Catherine moving with swift, terrifying purpose to call for immediate, specialized medical assistance, while William simultaneously, without a single second thought, canceled absolutely everything slated for his busy schedule the following morning, an act that sent shockwaves through his scheduling team. There was no agonizing discussion between the couple about managing optics, no heated debate about protocol, duty, or the expectations of the crown. The future king understood only one blazing truth in that moment of crisis. Whatever obligations waited outside those walls, whoever was expecting him to shake hands or cut ribbons could wait indefinitely while he tended to his boy. When the assembled medical team gravely advised continued rigorous observation and further clinical assessment rather than permitting an immediate return to the boy's normal routines, the emotional weight of the night shifted drastically, proving this was no longer a brief, terrifying scare they could simply place behind them by the time the sun came up and the palace gates opened. William absorbed the doctor's heavy words, nodded silently with a tightly set jaw, and walked slowly into an adjoining empty room completely alone, where Catherine eventually found him staring blankly at an untouched, glowing smartphone, utterly unable to force himself to answer the cascade of urgent messages blinking across the screen from staff demanding guidance. He realized with a sickening, profound clarity that he possessed the power to rearrange massive state engagements, command vast teams of highly educated advisors, and control the flow of global statements, but he was completely, terrifyingly powerless to unilaterally remove the invisible medical danger currently hanging over Louis, and that profound, paralyzing helplessness cut deeper into his soul than any public crisis or institutional scandal he had ever faced in his entire life. He finally broke the suffocating silence, telling his wife in a strained voice that he would personally handle canceling the next day's high-profile engagements, to which Catherine gently replied that he did not need to offer the demanding public any deep explanations or apologies for choosing his family, prompting him to look back at her and state with heartbreaking clarity that he did not owe the public an explanation, but he absolutely owed one to Louis, a statement that instantly and permanently settled any lingering internal argument between them about how to proceed. However, another incredibly difficult decision remained hovering in the air, as William desired absolute impenetrable silence regarding the matter to shield his boy. But the undeniable reality was that his sudden, repeated cancellations were already generating a whirlwind of chaotic questions across the news networks, leading Catherine to wisely warn him that uncontrolled, wild rumors spun by opportunistic commentators might end up wounding their vulnerable son significantly more than a carefully constructed, highly limited version of the truth. That mutual agreement solved one immediate problem, but simultaneously birthed another, forcing William to carry their unified choice into a formal room where the fierce desire for family privacy, the relentless demands of public duty, and the rigid, centuries-old royal protocol were about to violently and uncomfortably collide. Around that private, highly polished table, seasoned communications advisors nervously debated how much specific information might successfully calm the growing media speculation and satisfy the royal correspondents. And William sat listening with dangerous, coiled stillness until the moment the discussion inevitably drifted away from managing schedules and crept slowly toward releasing actual medical details, at which point he leaned forward and made his unyielding boundary unmistakably clear to everyone present. He firmly stated that the monarchy was free to explain his sudden absence, and it could broadly acknowledge a private family crisis to stop the most outlandish rumors, but his child's intimate medical condition would never, under any circumstances, become palace currency used to buy off the tabloids or appease the public's insatiable curiosity. The palace communications officials, trained for decades to feed the beast and control the narrative through managed transparency, deeply feared that continued silence could easily birth increasingly extreme and damaging speculation, especially if the energetic, highly visible young prince suddenly disappeared from all expected family routines and traditional holiday photographs, arguing during the briefing that a controlled release of information was entirely necessary to reduce uncertainty before the rumors gained unstoppable momentum. But the moment the future king heard the conversation inching dangerously toward discussing clinical tests, proposed treatments, and sensitive information that no child had ever consented to share with the globe, William decisively shut it down, closing the thick briefing folder with a sharp, resounding snap, physically pushing it several inches away across the table, and coldly informing every single advisor in the room that absolutely nobody would ever discuss his son's medical specifics again. His anger remained tightly coiled and impeccably controlled, which only served to make the warning infinitely sharper and more terrifying to the staff as he made it crystal clear that Louis was merely an 11-year-old boy who had not agreed to become the tragic subject of public medical analysis simply because his father was destined to one day inherit the British crown. William declared he would willingly accept endless probing questions about his own life, his leadership, and his decisions, but he would absolutely not surrender his child to the media machine, a stance that Catherine reinforced when she entered the conversation with a quieter but equally devastating, immovable force. When one particularly bold advisor dared to gently warn that their continued stubborn silence could create a massive reputational risk for the wider royal family and damage their carefully cultivated connection with the public, Catherine icily answered that Louis's personal dignity and emotional safety mattered infinitely more than any temporary institutional discomfort or bad press the palace might suffer. She intimately knew from her own brutal experiences in the public eye that a single, intimate detail, once casually released into the wild, could stubbornly follow a person for years, completely defining their public identity and robbing them of their autonomy, so the couple forged their next operational rule together. Absolutely every single public sentence concerning their son would require direct, explicit approval from one of them before anybody in the building was permitted to release it to the waiting world. Then, King Charles profoundly changed the balance of power completely, stepping into the fray and backing the couple without a single moment of hesitation, firmly instructing his own household staff to immediately absorb any additional duties rather than placing any pressure whatsoever on William to make forced, smiling appearances while his world was falling apart. The vast royal household, comprising the complex working structure supporting the monarch's official state responsibilities, would be forced to bend and adapt before the sick child ever did, a ruling that showed Charles deeply understood this unprecedented decision would massively complicate schedules, radically redistribute important engagements, and significantly increase the pressure on everyone else. Yet he absolutely refused to make his young grandson pay the emotional price for mere institutional convenience. William had successfully won the grueling fight over privacy, but the hard-fought victory carried a much larger, historic consequence, as Charles was no longer simply acting as a loving grandfather, protecting one child from unwanted attention. The reigning monarch was actively preparing to radically reshape how the entire royal family carried out its ancient duties during times of profound personal crisis, effectively rewriting the unwritten rules of the monarchy. This meant the impact of his decision would reach far beyond the confines of one closed meeting room, directly challenging the centuries-old tradition where the monarchy has ruthlessly demanded that personal, agonizing pain must always surrender to public obligation, forcing Charles to face the complete opposite choice and decisively choose family over the firm. His burdened heir desperately needed time, his sick grandson required unwavering stability, but the ancient institution demanded relentless continuity, meaning something massive had to give, and while the king could easily have demanded that William maintain a stoic public appearance while the palace quietly managed the crisis behind the scenes, he instead chose to model a radically different vision of royal duty. This new model was shaped not by cold emotional distance or stiff upper lip tradition, but by the profound conviction that fiercely protecting a vulnerable child could itself be viewed as a supreme act of service to the enduring strength of the family, a choice Charles understood the cost of immediately, given that he still carried heavy constitutional responsibilities and the formal state duties attached to the sovereign's role that simply could not vanish into thin air just because one branch of his family was navigating a terrifying crisis. William's drastically reduced schedule meant that high-profile engagements had to be swiftly moved, complex ceremonial appearances reassigned, and the heavy burden of public presence quietly spread across the remaining working members of the royal family, with Princess Anne readily and stoically agreeing to absorb selected, demanding commitments to allow the Wales household the necessary space to step back without creating an obvious, glaring gap in the royal calendar. Charles did not treat his sister's extra work as a mere favor, but rather treated the entire reshuffling as a deeply necessary historical correction, as watching William agonize and struggle between his inherent duty to the crown and his desperate instincts as a father deeply stirred painful memories. The king rarely discussed openly, bringing to the surface those bitter moments from his own past when rigid royal expectation had demanded his smiling presence in one place while his own young sons had desperately needed him somewhere else. In a quiet, fiercely private conversation, Charles admitted to his son that fathers tragically often understand far too late what should have truly mattered most, prompting William to hear the heavy, unspoken regret vibrating behind the older man's words and respond with a profound silence that carried significantly more emotional weight than any spoken argument ever could. Charles slowly removed his glasses after reviewing the heavily revised, chaotic royal diary and gently told William that Anne had already graciously agreed to cover one of the most pressing commitments of the week, a gesture William immediately protested against by claiming he did not want special treatment or to burden the rest of the family while he stayed home. The king looked directly at his heir and answered softly that providing a father time to be with his sick child was not special treatment. It was the family actively choosing to refuse to repeat the damaging, cold mistakes of their shared past, breaking a cycle of emotional deprivation that had haunted the institution for generations. William still hesitated, as the concept of duty had completely shaped his existence for years, and physically walking away from scheduled engagements felt dangerously close to failing the countless people who stood in the rain expecting him to appear. But Charles decisively ended the internal debate with two simple, unyielding words: "Go home." He then authorized the palace staff to officially describe the prince's reduced schedule only vaguely as a family priority, and strictly blocked any attempt by the press office to impose a rigid timetable for William's full return to public life, a decision that created desperately needed breathing room inside the palace walls, even as the intense pressure outside was already reaching a boiling point. Canceled appearances rapidly transformed into screaming headlines. Crowds gathering outside the gates began asking pointed questions. Prominent commentators loudly demanded clarity on 24-hour news networks, and William knew deep down there was one terrifying question that no carefully worded statement could ever fully silence. How serious was Louis's condition? The palace had successfully created a protective physical space around the boy, but the world outside the iron gates was preparing to rush violently into that quiet space with wild speculation, overwhelming sympathy, and an entirely new kind of suffocating pressure of its own, proving that while privacy can be strictly ordered inside a palace, it absolutely cannot be ordered outside one. Within mere hours, every single canceled engagement was dissected as evidence of a worsening prognosis. Every noticeable absence morphed into a convoluted theory, and every carefully chosen sanitized sentence released by the press office was aggressively examined for the secrets it refused to say. William had naturally expected a massive wave of attention, but what he had not anticipated was how terrifyingly fast that global attention would seep through the walls and reach the children themselves, suddenly shifting the battle from merely protecting Louis's medical privacy to desperately preventing absolute fear from becoming the permanent atmosphere of his childhood. William watched the mounting pressure build like a storm through every minor change in the family's schedule, while palace officials rigidly held the defensive line, accepting that a public engagement could be canceled or reassigned, but the royal couple would absolutely not exchange intimate medical details for a temporary, fleeting calm from the press. Charles had already fiercely backed that boundary, and nobody inside the sprawling household was prepared to break rank. But William still discovered in the most heartbreaking way just how incredibly fragile that protection could be when he casually checked his phone and found a dramatic, glaring headline focused entirely on Louis, prompting him to quickly lock the screen the very moment his son unexpectedly entered the room. He attempted to change the subject with unnatural speed, casually asking about something utterly ordinary, but the forced effort spectacularly failed when Louis quietly studied his father's tense face and innocently asked why everyone in the house had suddenly become so incredibly careful and quiet around him. William hesitated, struck by the painful realization that the very child he had been so desperately trying to shield had already deeply sensed the palpable fear his father mistakenly believed he was successfully hiding beneath a mask of forced normality. Catherine was simultaneously feeling the exact same crushing pressure from another direction, becoming deeply frustrated by the media's relentless demands for constant updates because a child's delicate medical recovery could not possibly be neatly arranged around a convenient broadcasting timetable designed for the evening news. She privately argued to her husband that every single new statement they released only risked creating an insatiable public expectation for another one until Louis's absolute hardest, most vulnerable days became something the public wrongly believed it was fully entitled to follow, dissect, and consume. William wholeheartedly agreed with her assessment, and together they made the difficult choice to remove several optional, upcoming public appearances involving George, Charlotte, and their younger brother, deliberately choosing physical and emotional distance over performing a forced, smiling normality for the cameras that would only confuse their children. Then, Charles subtly changed the heavy mood permeating the family with a much smaller, deeply personal gesture, sending William a quiet, handwritten note gently offering to visit Louis entirely privately, promising there would be no photographers, no grand ceremony, no public announcement, and no official role to play, seeking only unstructured time to simply sit with his grandson. William read the heartfelt note twice before silently showing it to Catherine, and for the very first time in what felt like endless, agonizing days, the decision sitting in front of them did not feel like a frantic exercise in damage control, but a genuine moment of familial support. But the impending visit would soon expose something much deeper about the situation, as William had spent the entire crisis obsessively controlling phones, crafting statements, managing schedules, and guarding doors, genuinely believing that ultimate protection meant keeping all signs of fear completely away from Louis. When the reigning monarch and his young grandson finally sat together in that quiet room, William would begin to understand with a heavy heart that the observant child already knew far more about the gravity of his situation than anyone had been willing to admit, sensing the unspoken anxieties that filled the air. The true turning point of this emotional saga did not arrive through a grand palace announcement or a sterile medical briefing, but rather it came through an intimate, quiet conversation with zero advisors present, no hidden microphones, and absolutely no ancient institution standing between the people involved. William had spent exhausting days trying to construct a fortress to protect Louis from fear, but in doing so, he had vastly underestimated his young son's sharp awareness, as the child could clearly see through the careful, strained smiles and the abruptly interrupted conversations whenever he walked into a room. When Louis finally found the courage to ask his father directly whether everyone believed he was incredibly fragile, William experienced a profound realization that true protection also required deep honesty, recognizing that he had foolishly mistaken total silence for actual strength, leaving his son to navigate his own fears in isolation. By this stage in the crisis, Louis remained under very close medical care and strict family observation, but the initial suffocating first wave of panic had eased just enough for ordinary, mundane routines to slowly return in small, manageable pieces, allowing a fragile semblance of peace to settle over Adelaide Cottage. Medical observation, the agonizing period when doctors continue watching a patient closely before deciding what happens next, had seamlessly become a normal part of their family life without being allowed to completely define it. But the underlying tension remained a constant, humming presence. William still carried a heavy knot of fear with him everywhere he went, but his youngest son could clearly see it manifesting even when nobody spoke a word about it, leading Louis to finally ask the tough question his father had been desperately avoiding. Why did everyone suddenly lower their voices whenever he walked into a room? William chose not to hide behind hollow reassurance this time, speaking truthfully as he told his son that people were acting worried simply because they loved him very much, not because they believed he had somehow become permanently weak or broken, validating the boy's observations without escalating his anxiety. Then Louis asked something even harder, wondering quietly if he was still allowed to just be normal, prompting the future king to sit closely beside him and answer with fierce conviction that illness did not in any way erase who he was as a person, a prince, or a beloved son. His son offered a small, genuine smile, and William finally smiled back without having to force the muscles in his face to cooperate, a moment of authentic connection that briefly pierced the gloom. But then Louis said the one thing that completely broke through his father's remaining, carefully constructed emotional control. The young prince admitted in a small voice that seeing his mother look so sad frightened him significantly more than the physical reality of being unwell. Words that landed heavily on William's heart because they brutally exposed what every adult in the house had tried so hard to conceal. His son had not been shielded from the tension at all. He had been quietly and meticulously studying it. Later that night, William relayed the heartbreaking conversation to Catherine, and together they made the conscious, difficult decision that the family would completely stop pretending that everything was completely normal, agreeing that the difficult days would be honestly acknowledged within their walls, but ordinary, joyful life would still be fiercely protected wherever possible. When Charles arrived later without his usual royal retinue, entering the house not as a towering sovereign, but purely as a doting grandfather, he teased Louis gently and effortlessly drew bright laughter from a room that had grown entirely too careful and quiet, shifting the emotional dynamic of the household. William stood back and watched his son's heavy mood visibly lift, understanding something profound he had missed throughout the ordeal. The suffocating fear was not disappearing through their rigid silence. It was finally shrinking because the family had stopped pretending it did not exist, allowing genuine connection to replace fearful management. That private, unguarded exchange gave William something the vast resources of the palace could never manufacture, which was absolute clarity, making him ready for one final public step, not to reveal the clinical details of Louis's condition, but to firmly define what the nation should understand about the resilient child existing behind the sensational headlines. By the next morning, the emotional weight of the crisis belonged to far more people than just those locked inside the palace walls, even if its private medical details remained fiercely protected from the public eye, as a massive wave of genuine sympathy spread quickly across the country, alongside a fierce debate over where the boundary of public concern should appropriately end. Then one poignant image captured the national mood far better than any highly paid television commentator could. Outside the imposing walls of Windsor, handmade messages intended specifically for Louis began appearing beside piles of flowers and colorful children's drawings, none of them demanding complex explanations, none of them asking for a specific diagnosis, but instead offering something infinitely simpler and purer. A young, prominent prince had transformed in the public's eyes from a royal figurehead into simply a child that people genuinely wanted to see well again, and William watched this overwhelming response with a complex mixture of deep gratitude for the support and lingering discomfort over the intense scrutiny. British and international media coverage centered intensely on his initial confirmation of the illness and the family's unprecedented decision to place Louis's well-being far ahead of royal appearances, and while the more responsible outlets respectfully avoided guessing at a specific diagnosis, the sheer existence of a royal engagement suddenly looked trivial when placed beside a child's health. Commentators debated endlessly over whether William stepping back showed institutional weakness or heralded a more evolved, human idea of royal service, and the future king knew that every single published opinion inevitably circled back to his son, heightening his desire to maintain the invisible wall he had built. Catherine, however, clearly understood the latent danger hiding within that massive wave of attention, and when William showed her a continuous stream of highly supportive online messages, she astutely reminded him that public affection and media intrusion were not the same thing, even when the delicate boundary between them felt incredibly thin and easily crossed. She deeply wanted Louis to eventually know that people cared for him, but she resolutely refused to let global kindness become a Trojan horse for exposing intimate details he might one day wish had remained fiercely private, a boundary she was willing to defend against both the press and the public's well-meaning curiosity. Her husband fully agreed with her assessment, though the intense national focus still deeply unsettled his protective instincts, a tension that Charles also felt acutely during this period as he navigated the delicate balance between acknowledging his subjects' support and shielding his family's privacy. Charles told William during a quiet conversation that public compassion did not in any way create a binding debt of disclosure, assuring his son that while the monarch was deeply moved by the nation's response, he firmly insisted that Louis should never have to repay their sympathy with invasive information about his own body or medical treatment. That powerful assurance from the sovereign further strengthened the unyielding line the family had already drawn in the sand, solidifying their stance until one specific message managed to shift the mood entirely and remind them of the genuine, uncomplicated affection that existed outside the palace walls. Outside Windsor Castle, a small, respectful crowd gathered near the public barriers, and nestled among the vibrant flowers sat a simple, handmade card from another child that read, "Get well soon, Louis. We miss your smile," a pure expression of empathy that television cameras captured, quickly turning those few words into the prevailing emotional symbol of the day. William was shown the image, studied it quietly on his phone, and then silently passed the device to Catherine, whispering that Louis should probably see that specific one when the moment felt right, recognizing the value of such innocent support. Ultimately, William approved one final, incredibly short public message, formally thanking the people for their overwhelming kindness, while explicitly reiterating his intent to preserve his son's privacy, making it absolutely clear that after this, there would be no answers given to every wild rumor and no surrender to every media demand for more access. The frantic headlines had reached their peak, the palace had successfully drawn its impenetrable boundary, and now only the final, lasting meaning of the ordeal remained, settling over the family as they adjusted to their new reality. The single most important decision Prince William made during this entire crisis had absolutely nothing to do with the line of succession, royal ceremony, or managing his public image. He deliberately chose to remain a father before performing the demanding role of a future king, a choice that redefined his legacy. Catherine chose the sanctity of privacy over bowing to intense institutional pressure. Charles chose deep familial compassion over upholding rigid historical tradition, and young Louis, completely without intending to, forced 3 generations of the royal family to confront a deeply uncomfortable truth about the sacrifices demanded by the crown. An ancient institution survives and thrives not because its members blindly refuse to ever break routine, but because they possess the wisdom to understand which grand responsibilities become utterly meaningless when measured against the health and safety of someone they deeply love. William no longer offered any apologies for stepping back from the spotlight, maintaining a highly flexible royal diary because Louis's care and recovery could never be forced into neat, predictable dates just for the sake of public convenience or diplomatic expectations. Catherine stood fiercely beside that decision because she had defended that exact same principle from the very beginning, cementing the unshakable rule that their son's health belonged first and foremost to him alone, not to the state. Public sympathy could be warmly welcomed, the kindness of strangers could be cherished and remembered, but private medical information would remain locked away as fiercely private, even after the media pressure had reached its absolute highest point and the demands for disclosure became deafening. Charles helped make that new reality possible by continuously redistributing essential royal duties across the working family, with Anne and other senior royals seamlessly absorbing the heavy responsibilities that might otherwise have fallen squarely onto William's shoulders, ensuring the machinery of state continued to hum quietly in the background. The monarchy kept moving forward, but something fundamental inside its core had shifted as the sovereign no longer treated family vulnerability as a dangerous threat to royal stability, but rather treated deep compassion as an essential component of modern leadership, helping his son finally understand that bending ancient tradition did not equate to weakening the crown. William felt that profound change most deeply in his evolving relationship with his father, as Charles imparted the wisdom that institutions only survive because the people running them know when rules must serve human needs rather than cruelly crush them, a lesson that would shape William's future reign. The future king carried those resonant words with him as Louis remained safely protected from public diagnosis. Catherine remained a fortress against media intrusion, and the family emerged from the immediate crisis significantly calmer, visibly closer, and far less willing to ever let outside speculation control their private reality. Then came the simplest, most vital decision of all, when William finally finished his last required palace phone call of the day and returned to the quiet room with Louis and Catherine, only to hear another urgent message ping loudly on his phone. He briefly saw the illuminated screen, deliberately set the device aside face down on the table, and sat closely beside his son without bothering to answer it, deciding in that quiet space that absolutely nothing existing outside that specific moment mattered more. And that silent, profound action became the true final meeting of the crisis, proving definitively that while the heavy weight of the crown constantly demanded William's time and the hungry world endlessly demanded answers, a young boy simply needed his father. And when the ultimate choice finally came, William made absolutely certain there was never any doubt in anyone's mind about exactly who came first.